Hello everyone, this is the third lecture in our course on human behavior. So now in this course, as I said, what we will be doing is we will be studying human behavior and we will be studying how human beings react and what is the way to study how human reacts to certain situations. And understanding these things in different situations is crucial and it is difficult as well. Studying how people behave and react to different things is not an easy task. And in contrast to the natural sciences, human behavior cannot be predicted using a set of establishing theories. This is because human beings are studying human beings, and we are trying to understand ourselves, which is difficult to study. On the other hand, the problem also lies with the fact that human beings are unpredictable. The behavior of human beings, the reaction of human beings to stimulus are unpredictable. And so, once the behavior or the reaction is unpredictable, we need a way to measure this behavior. So let's make it simple. Imagine you have a friend. Now, your friend might react differently to different stimulus depending on the environment. So, how do you make a prediction? That's where the science of psychology comes in to help us. The science of psychology gives us methods and tools to actually make predictions of how a person might react in different situations. Now, so let's say you have a friend and you want to play with them, but you are not sure what they will do. If you know how they act in different situations, you can guess what they might do and then plan accordingly. This is why studying psychology is important. Psychology is a science that teaches us about human behavior. By studying psychology, we can learn how to predict people's actions and understand their behavior better. It's like playing a game. If you know the rules, it's much easier and more fun. And understanding people is like playing a game. It's easier when you know about psychology. Unlike other sciences that study things that don't move, like rocks and plants, psychology is the only science that studies the most interesting thing of all, which is people. People can be complicated and unpredictable, but that's what makes psychology so exciting. Instead of knowing for sure what will happen, psychologists used probabilities to make educated guesses about human behavior. And that's why psychologists are high in demand and get paid well in some countries. By learning about psychology, you can become a people expert and figure out mysteries of human behavior. And what we'll do in this lecture, in this third lecture of human behavior course, I will summarize what was covered in the first two lectures. And to recap in the first two lectures, what I did was I introduced the science of psychology. In the beginning of our course on human behavior, we defined psychology and discussed its purposes. Also, what does it do and why should we study psychology? We emphasized that psychology is the field of study that explores human behavior, why people act and how they act and how to measure it. Now, we established that psychology is the study of human behavior and mental processes, which is the underlying reason for human behavior. In our first two lectures, we talked about psychology being the study of how people behave and think. We explored the history of psychology and how it evolved from philosophy. Early philosophers such as Socrates, Aristotle, John Locke, and René Descartes developed theories and ideas about human behavior. And in the first lecture, we covered various schools of psychology, including structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, gestaltism, and psychoanalysis. Further on, we moved on the newer schools of psychology, for example, cognitive neuroscience and psycholinguistics, and so on and so forth. In the second lecture, what we did was we did a review of all these and discussed different perspectives in psychology on how to approach and solve psychological problems. Those perspectives were psychoanalytic perspective, the behavioral perspective, cognitive perspective, the subjective perspective, and so on and so forth. In the previous lecture, we talked about how the same event in psychology can be viewed and analyzed from different perspectives. This basically allows for a more comprehensive understanding of why a particular event occurs. Other than that, what we focused on was looking at the various methods used in psychological research, such as the experimental method, hypothesis, statistical analysis, correlational method, survey method, and observation case histories, also literature review method. And towards the end of the lecture in the last class, what we talked about ethics while doing research, especially in psychology where experiments involve people and animal. It's really important that researchers treat their subject with kindness and respect. One key thing they need to do is to get informed consent from participants before the study starts. This means explaining to them what will happen in the study and letting them decide if they want to be part of it or not. We discussed a bunch of other ethical considerations too. Those are all about how to make sure people are treated well in research studies. So from now on, we will look into specific aspects of psychology or components of psychology, and we will see how these components actually build up in understanding human behavior or human psychology. And one of the first basic concepts to understand is something referred to as sensory process. Now, what is sensory process? Sensory processes are how your body helps you understand the world around you. Now, as you know that you have 5 sense organs, which are eyes, nose, ears, tongue and skin. And all of that sense organs work together to help you make sense of what you see, hear, smell, taste and touch. And sensory processes are the fundamental concept in psychology that helps us understand how our senses work together and how they affect our thoughts and actions. Essentially, these sense organs take information from the physical world and translate into something that your brain can understand so that you can experience the world around you. In this discussion, I will provide you with a brief overview of sensory processes and why they are important and how they relate to the study of psychology. So I won't go into great detail because this is not a comprehensive course on psychophysics or sensory systems. Rather, I will give a quick overview to help you understand the basic concepts. So, sensory processes are really important because they help us make sense of what we are experiencing. For example, if we see a red apple, our eyes send information to our brain to tell us what we are seeing. This information helps us identify the apple and understand its red. Psychology studies how our brain and our senses work together to help us experience the world. So before starting, let us actually create a scenario to give you what sensory process means. Now let's imagine you are walking on a beach on a sunny day. There are several things that you hear or several kind of stimuli which is impinging on you, and also several kind of signals from the environment which is impinging on you. For example, you feel the warm sun on your skin, the scent between your toes, and the salty ocean air in your nose. And you see the blue sky and the waves are crashing onto your shore. Also, you hear the sound of the waves and the seagulls calling in the distance. So what is happening here? All of these things are sensory inputs that your body is processing to help you experience the world around you. Even though there are many different things happening at once, your senses work together to create a cohesive experience. Imagine you are sitting in a quiet room studying for an exam. Although it's a quiet room, but there are still several stimuli that are impinging on you, like the light from the computer screen and the electromagnetic waves from the Wi-Fi router and even the cosmic radiation that is constantly passing through us. All of these signals are around us, but we are not able to perceive them without the proper sensory processes or technology. These signals, although hardly noticeable, are still affecting us in various ways. As humans, we experience various stimuli or signals from our environment throughout the day. Some of these signals you can perceive while others are beyond your range of perception. For instance, when you are walking on a beach, there are different sounds and sights around you, some of which you can hear or see while others you cannot. Now, we will be exploring how our brain processes these signals and how they help us understand the world around us. Now, these signals essentially help you to create a picture of the external world. For example, when you see a tree, your eyes are picking up the visual signal and your brain is interpreting that signal to create an image of that tree. Let's say you are looking out of a window and I ask you to describe what you see. You might see a brown and green cylindrical object, but what you are actually seeing, they are teeny particles of light called photons that are reflecting off the object and entering into your eyes. Your eyes then send this information to your brain, which takes these teeny particles of light and organizes them into a recognizable image. Now, these photons enter into your eye and are processed by your brain in a certain region that compares them to the past experience and knowledge. So, based on this comparison, your brain is able to identify the object as a tree. Now, imagine someone wearing a brown pant and a green shirt. They are obviously not a tree, but when you see something with brown bark and green leaves on top, you recognize it as a tree. So, how does your brain know the difference? That is interesting thing, right? So, what the eyes actually see is the physical stimulus, which is basically photons, but what human perceive or see out of it is tree. Your brain turns those photons into something you can understand like a tree. The process of turning those photons into something you can understand is called sensation. And it happens not just with your eyes, but also with your other senses like touch, taste, and smell. For example, when you touch something like a hot stove, your nerves are sending signals to your brain. Your brain then interprets those signals and tells you that the stove is hot and you should move your hand. So, sensation is really just the process of turning physical stimuli like light or pressure waves or heat into something you can understand and react to. Have you ever wondered how your body perceives the things around you? Well, your body is able to detect different physical stimuli such as light, sound, pressure, and temperature, and so on. So, this detection is known as sensation. Sensation is a process where your body encodes the physical stimuli into signals that the brain can understand. So, for example, when you touch a hot stove, the sensation of heat is encoded into a signal that is sent to the brain, and the brain then processes this signal and creates the experience of pain or discomfort. Similarly, when you hear a loud noise, the sensation of sound is encoded into a signal and that is sent to the brain, and then the brain processes this signal and creates the experience of hearing. So, sensation is the process of detecting and encoding physical stimuli, and the brain then uses this information to create your psychological experience of the world around you. So, let's begin exploring the sensory process and learn how our sensory systems work. In simple terms, the sensory processes involve how we perceive and interpret the physical element. Our senses help us experience the world around us through different physical qualities like light, sound, temperature, and pressure. These all qualities are part of the external environment, but when they enter into our body, they become part of our internal sensory system. the photons from light, air pressure from sound, and the temperature that we feel, all of those are part of this psychological system. Now, our sensory system then processes this information to help us. The sensory system or the sensory processes are how your body detects physical qualities like light, sound, and temperature and turns them into psychological experiences like seeing, hearing, and feeling hot or cold. For example, our eyes take in light and turn it into image, while our ears take in sound and turn it into recognizable noises. So this is how we interact with the world around us. Your sensory organs like your eyes, ears, and skin receive these physical signals and translate them into something your brain can understand. The sensory system is the interface between the physical world and your perception of it. So, what is sensory system? Sensory system is a detection mechanism. It's like a translator that helps us understand the physical world around us. The physical world has things like temperature, which can be measured with numbers like 2, 3, or 4 degrees, but in our minds, we interpret these numbers as feelings like hot or cold. So, the sensory systems helps us turn physical sensation into psychological experiences. In the physical world, we have things like photons, which are light particles, and then sound and temperatures and so on. So for example, we can measure the number of photons like 4 photons, 8 photons, or the frequency of sound waves like 1 Hz, 5 Hz, 10 Hz, etc. But in our psychological world, we perceive this physical stimuli as bright or dull, or you can say loud or soft, hot or cold, and so on. We use words like color, brightness, pitch, and volume to describe our perception of physical stimuli. So, sensory system is what helps us translate the physical world into our psychological experiences. So, how we are able to feel things like hot and cold, or see different colors and hear different sound? All of these experiences come from our senses, which are like detection mechanisms that helps us take in information about the world around us. So, when we see something like a bright light or a colorful flower, our eyes are actually taking in teeny packets of energy called photons. And when we touch something, our skin senses pressure and temperature to help us feel different textures and temperatures. But how does all of this information get turned into something that our brain can understand and make sense of? That's where sensation comes in. Sensation is the process of turning all of this physical stimuli into something that our brain can interpret and use to form a perception of the world around us. So, sensation is all about encoding physical stimuli and translating it into something that our brain can understand and use to make sense of the world. Now, this is the whole thing of how you convert the physical stimulus into the psychological stimulus is basically the act of sensation. Now, how does the sensation really work? Sensation is a two-part process that involves encoding physical stimuli from our environment into a form that our brain can understand. First, it involves figuring out which aspects of the environment are relevant and which ones are not. The second step involves encoding the relevant information in a form that the brain can read and make sense of it. This allows the brain to interpret the information and react appropriately. However, this is a difficult question to answer because it's beyond the scope of this introductory lecture on psychology. Although I cannot answer this question directly, but I can discuss how the problem is being solved. For example, how sensory process work with bats and dogs. Bats have a strong sense of hearing but poor vision. So they use their ability to hear high-pitched sounds to navigate while flying. On the other hand, dogs have a poor sense of sight but a strong sense of smell. So they rely on their sense of smell to detect and interpret environmental information. This shows that the sensory stimulus record with our senses, which depends on the organism and its specific sensory abilities. The main reason why humans can only see the visible range of spectra is because of adaptation, which has developed over a long period of time. However, it is still unclear why the human eye is limited to only seeing within the ultraviolet to infrared range. The visible spectrum lies within this range and is composed of the colors which we remember with the acronym VIVGR, which are violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow and red. Any colors beyond this range are invisible to humans. The reason why humans can only see a certain range of colors cannot be fully explained here, but it has to do with how human eyes have adapted over time. Other animals like dogs can see infrared and some animals can even see ultraviolet. The main focus of this lecture is how our sense organs gather and effectively make sense of information. So what we are going to do in this lecture is we want to know what characteristics of our sense organs allow us to collect and interpret information in a meaningful way. In the upcoming lectures, we will look at how our brains interpret the information gathered by our sense organs, and this process is known as perception. However, in this lecture, we will concentrate on how external information is collected by our sense organs and then transmitted to our brains. And we want to know how this information is converted into electrical signals and then decoded by our brains. So let's start by understanding what sensations are. So at the psychological level, sensations are basic, unprocessed experiences that occur in response to stimuli. As we learned earlier, sensations are interpretations of physical stimuli such as change in temperature, pressure, then light intensity and the amount of photons, also air pressure and other form of waves. In short, sensations refer to the initial experiences we have in response to the external stimuli. For example, feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin, hearing the sound of a bird chirping, or seeing the color red are all sensation. So the sensation of warmth is associated with an increase in temperature and the sensation of loudness is associated with an increase in sound intensity. Now, sensations of sight allow us to see objects in different colors and shapes. So, if we look at photons, the same number of photons has several variables or several parameters to it. The same number of photons can actually describe psychological facts like intensity, psychological facts like color, psychological facts like situation. These are psychological features that can be described by the amount of photons received. Our eyes can sense various things such as color, shape, and form of the object. Even though the same number of photons can describe different things, it can also provide psychological information like intensity, color, and saturation. When we see an object, our eyes not only detect its shape and type, but also the form or structure of the object. So it means that when we see something, our eyes not only identify the object and its shape, but also identify its form or structure. For example, when you look at a ball, your eyes can detect not only that it's round, but also its size and texture. As we have learned from the Gestalt theory, what really happens is that when we look at something, our eyes separate the object into foreground and background, and this helps us perceive the object's shape. Our eyes have special cells that detect angles, lines, curves, and other features of an object. This helps us understand what the object looks like and its form. So, sensations can tell you how this object is or what is the nature of this object. Now, at the perceptual level, our brain integrates and interprets the raw sensory experiences and gives meaning to them. The external stimuli or information that comes in contact with our sensory organs are processed and transformed into a format that our brain can understand and derive meaning from. This process of deriving meaning from raw sensory experience is called perception. Our senses help us receive information from the world around us. For example, our eyes see things, our ears hear sounds, our skin feels touch, or our tongue tastes flavors, and our nose smells scents. This information we receive through our senses is called sensation. Sensations are like the raw materials that our brain receives. They are the fundamental experiences associated with the stimuli that we receive through our senses. However, our brain needs to make sense of these raw materials to understand what it means. The process of understanding and interpreting this sensation is called perception. So, that is what the difference between sensation and perception. So, sensation is when our senses gather information from the external environment and send it to our brain. This information is in the form of physical stimuli such as light or sound waves. On the other hand, perception is the process of making sense of this raw information by interpreting and organizing it into a meaningful experience. So, sensation is the first step in processing external information, while perception is the second step where the brain gives meaning to this information. So let's see an example. When we see an apple, our eyes receive information about its shape, color, and texture. But it's our brain that tells us that it's an apple and we can eat it. So perception is like the way our brain takes these raw sensations and turn them into a meaningful information. It's like making sense of what we see, hear, feel, taste, and smell. So, sensory systems have certain characteristics that allow them to work. To help us understand this, we can look at a device called a multimeter. A multimeter is a tool that can measure the electrical output of any plug in your home. Now, when you purchase a multimeter, what are you looking at? You want to ensure that it can accurately detect the amount of electric current passing through a wire or a plug. A multimeter is a device that measures voltage, current, and resistivity. So now, what is voltage? Voltage refers to the force or pressure that causes electricity to flow, while current is the flow of electric charge. And what is resistivity? Resistivity is, on the other hand, refers to the measure of material's ability to resist the flow of electric current. A good multimeter should be able to measure all of these parameters accurately. These are important characteristics of a good multimeter. Now, when buying a multimeter, what are the things you should look for? The most important thing to look for is accuracy. But how do you measure accuracy? When you want to buy a good multimeter to work with currents and circuits, one of the most important things you need to look for is accuracy. So now, what is accuracy? Accuracy means how close the reading is to the true value of the current or voltage you are measuring. So if a multimeter is accurate, it will give you a reading that is very close to the actual value. For example, if you measure a current of 2 ampere, an accurate multimeter will show a reading very close to 2 ampere, like 1.9 ampere or 2.1 ampere, rather than showing a completely different value like 3 or 4 ampere. So, to measure the accuracy of a good multimeter, sensitivity is a way to measure how well a sensory system can pick up or detect information from the environment. Sensitivity refers to how well the multimeter can detect changes in the current or voltage being measured. Similarly, the sensitivity of a sensory system refers to how well it can accurately detect and process information from the environment. In other words, sensitivity is a characteristic of sensory system that determines how easily and accurately they can collect and interpret information from the environment. All of the sensory organs or modalities such as ear, eye, skin, all of those have two common characteristics or parameters that define them. These parameters determine how accurate the sensory organs are and how they measure in terms of sensitivity. First quality is how sensitive the sense organ is. Sensitivity means how well the sense organ can collect information from the environment. This is important for senses like hearing, seeing, touching, and smelling. The second quality is how the sense organ interprets the information it collects. This is important because it helps us understand the meaning of the information collected by our senses. So, what is sensitivity? Sensitivity refers to how well a sensory system can detect or measure the different qualities of an external stimulus. So, sensitivity is basically how well our senses can detect and interpret both low and high level of information. Just like when you buy a multimeter and the first thing you want to know is how accurate this is and how sensitive it is. A multimeter needs to be sensitive enough to measure different level of voltage and current accurately. Our senses also needs to be sensitive enough to detect and interpret different qualities of the stimuli in our environment. For example, our eyes need to be sensitive enough to see things in low light conditions or to distinguish between different shades of colors, and our ears need to be sensitive enough to pick up soft sounds as well as loud sounds. Similarly, in this case, the sensitivity of the sensory system determines whether it can detect stimuli with high or low intensity or not. For example, a good multimeter can measure both high and low voltage accurately. Similarly, a good sensory system can perceive both high and low intensity stimuli accurately. Sensitivity is a measure of the sensory modality at the psychological level, describing how well the sensory system can process and understand the quality of the information it receives. Also, sensitivity describes how a sensory system collects information, and it is the quality or quantity of information that sensory system can detect. And sensory coding is a characteristics of sensory system that describes how the sensory information is processed at the biological level. It tells us how the sensory organs and nerves are designed to convert the stimuli that our brain can interpret. In the case of a multimeter, sensory coding would refer to the internal circuitry and design of the device that allows it to accurately measure electrical currents and voltage. The way the circuits are arranged and designed influences how the multimeter works and how accurate its readings are. In human sensory systems, sensitivity refers to how accurate a sensory system is in providing information. It's like how accurately our eyes can see colors or our ears can hear sounds. For example, can our eyes distinguish between different shades of color, or can our ears hear sounds at different volumes? It's about the quality of information that the sensory system can give at a psychological level. For example, the sensory system can provide information about color, saturation, background, let's say figure, and other detail. The accuracy of the sensory system determines the quality of the information it provides. And sensory coding refers to the process of how sensory information is encoded in the brain. So, when a photon enters into the eye, for example, sensory coding explains how the brain processes this photon to interpret its color, form, and other relevant information. It describes the method of converting sensory inputs into a language that the brain can understand. So, sensitivity refers to how much information it can provide, and sensory coding refers to how it can occur. In sensory systems, sensitivity refers to how accurately the system can perceive and provide information about the environment, while sensory coding refers to the process of how the information is being interpreted and encoded in the brain. In the context of a multimeter, sensitivity refers to how accurately it can measure and provide information about electric current or voltage, while sensory coding in this context refers to the internal workings of the device including its circuits and algorithms that allow it to process and display the measured information. So basically, while sensitivity refers to the quality of output, sensory coding refers to the process of how the output is being produced. And that is what the two differences are. So, how do I define this sensitivity? In psychology, the sensitivity can be expressed in terms of certain threshold. So now, what is threshold? A threshold is a point where a stimulus is just strong enough to be detected by the sensory system. We use the concept of threshold to measure the sensitivity. This means that any system which can measure the accuracy of a signal can be described in terms of threshold. There are two types of threshold. One is absolute threshold and another one is differential threshold. So let's start first with what is an absolute threshold and what is a differential threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulus energy needed to detect a stimulus at least 50% of the time, while the differential threshold is the minimum amount of difference between two stimuli that can be detected at least 50% of the time. This threshold helps us understand how sensitive our senses are and how accurately they can detect stimuli. So let's go back a little bit and understand the concept of threshold. Sensitivity is how accurate a measuring system is. It tells us the range of values a system can measure. In the case of a multimeter, sensitivity means how accurately it can measure different values, like how accurate it can measure the voltage or current. When we use a multimeter to measure electricity, we want to make sure that it can measure small values accurately. This is called sensitivity. So to determine the sensitivity of a multimeter, we check it if it can detect zero values and if it can tell the difference between 0 and 1. If a multimeter is highly sensitive, it can measure very small electrical currents or voltages accurately. The more sensitive the multimeter is, the better it can measure small values. Now, threshold is like a limit or a boundary. For example, if we want to see how dark it can get before we cannot see anything, we can turn off all the lights and wait for our eyes to adjust. Eventually, it will get so dark that we won't be able to see anything. That is our visual threshold for darkness. So threshold in this case of multimeter means that the minimum value it can detect or measure. So sensitivity is like how well our body parts can detect things, and threshold is like a limit or a boundary below or average which we cannot sense or detect things. Now, to measure sensitivity, the first thing to consider is the absolute threshold. So, what is absolute threshold? Absolute threshold refers to the point where a person starts to perceive something. It's the point where our responses changes from no to yes or where 0 becomes 1. Absolute threshold is the minimum amount of physical stimulus needed for a person to start seeing or feeling something. So, to understand this, let's do a simple experiment. Imagine you are in a dark room and someone lights a candle. You cannot see anything at first, but as the candle gets closer and closer to you, there comes a point where you start to see the light from the candle. This point where you first start to see the light is called the absolute threshold. It's like the minimum amount of light you need to be able to see something. Similarly, for any other senses like hearing or touch, there is a minimum amount of stimulus needed to feel or hear something, and that's called the absolute threshold. Let's say we are in a very dark room and we have a very small candle that is far away. So when we light the candle, the person in the room might not be able to see the light because the candle is too small and far away. Even though we have one candle, it might not be enough to create a sensation of light for that person. So imagine you are in a dark room and I light a teeny candle. Even though the candle is producing light, you might not be able to see it at first. As I increase the number of candles, there will be a point where you suddenly say, yes, I can see the light. This point is called the absolute threshold. absolute threshold is the point where the minimum amount of stimulation needed for your brain to register a sensory experience. For example, if they see the light when there are 3 candles but not when there are 2 candles, the absolute threshold is 1 candle. So the absolute threshold is 3 candles minus 2 candles, which is 1 candle. So absolute threshold is the point at which any sensory system starts detecting a stimulus from no stimulus. It's the point where the sensory system goes from detecting 0 to 1 stimulus. This absolute threshold is important for all sensory systems because it helps to establish a baseline or a starting point for the detection of stimuli. Physical systems can have a value of 0, but humans cannot. You might wonder why a person cannot see a candle even though it has more than 100 photons of light. Meanwhile, a physical detector can detect even just 1 photon of light. The reason for this is the presence of white noise in our brain, which makes it difficult to detect low levels of stimulations. Due to this, it might take more than 1 candle for a person to begin to detect the presence of light in a dark room. However, the brain is constantly receiving random signals which can make it hard for humans to notice a small amount of stimulation. This is why it may take more than 1 candle for a person to begin to detect the presence of the light in a dark room. The human brain naturally produces a lot of random signals, also known as white noise, due to the constant firing of neurons. This background noise can make it more difficult for the brain to detect small amount of stimulation. So, have you ever tried to close your eyes and be completely still? You might have noticed that it's difficult to do so. This is because the brain has a lot of activity going on all the time, which creates noise, and it's called neural noise. This noise can make it hard for the brain to detect small amounts of stimulation like the light from 1 candle. Now imagine you are in a dark room with 1 candle. Your brain is still full of noise, so it's hard for you to see the light from 1 candle. But if you add 1 more candle, the light gets brighter and it becomes easier for you to detect the light against the background noise. So when you add 3 candles, your brain can finally detect the light and you can see it. This point where your brain can first detect the light is called the absolute threshold. So unlike the human brain, physical stimulus does not have any background noise. So that's why physical stimulus like a photon detector can detect even just 1 photon of light. On the other hand, humans have a lot of background noise in their brains, which makes it harder to detect low levels of stimulation. So this is why humans require more stimuli before they can detect it. This difference will be discussed further in the theory of signal detection, which will be covered later in the lecture. So, the concept we are currently focusing on is the absolute threshold. It refers to the minimum level of stimulation required for a person or a system to detect the presence of a stimulus. In other words, it's the point where something that we could not detect before suddenly becomes detectable. Now, how do I measure this absolute threshold? To measure this absolute threshold, we need to conduct an experiment where a person is shown a stimulus such as light at different intensities and take into consideration the fact that the person's brain produces a lot of background neural noise. So due to this noise, the person's response to seeing a stimulus may vary. Sometimes they may see the light at a low intensity and sometimes they may not. What we need to do? We need to conduct many trials to see when the person starts to consistently report that they can see the stimulus. For example, during 100 trials, the person may report seeing the stimulus with 3 candles, sometimes with 4 candles, and even with 2 candles. Then we collect the data on the person's responses and analyzing these responses by using statistical methods. Then we can determine at what intensity the person starts to consistently report that they can see the stimulus. This intensity is called the absolute threshold. Let's say we want to measure the absolute threshold for detecting the scent of a certain perfume. We start with a very low concentration of the perfume and gradually increase the concentration until the person can detect the scent 50% of the time. We would ask the person to sniff the perfume and they say yes if they can detect the scent or say no if they cannot. We would repeat this process several times and each time we will increasing the concentration of the perfume slightly. We would keep track of how many times the person said yes and how many times they said no for each concentration level. Then we can plot this data on a graph with the concentration of the perfume on the x-axis and the percentage of yes responses on the y-axis. The point at which the person can detect the scent 50% of the time is the absolute threshold. This is the concentration of the perfume that is just noticeable to the person. This absolute threshold would determine how sensitive the human nose is to that particular perfume, and it could be used to compare the strength of the different perfumes or to see if a person's sense of smell changes over the time, and that determines the sensitivity of any sensory system. Absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulus that can be detected by a person. For example, it's the weakest light that a person can see in a complete darkness. To find the absolute threshold, we conduct an experiment where we gradually increase the intensity of the stimulus such as light, sound or scent until the person can detect it. We also gradually decrease the intensity of the stimulus until the person can no longer detect it. We repeat this process multiple times to get an average value of the intensity at which the person can detect the stimulus 50% of the time. After running a lot of these trials, you take an average of the point at which the person detected the stimulus 50% of the time. This is the absolute threshold. It's the minimum amount of stimulus that can be detected by someone with average sensitivity. Psychologists use different methods to measure how our mind responds to physical stimuli, such as light. The method I described to measure absolute threshold, which is the minimum amount of stimulus that we can detect, is called the method of limits. This is a psychological procedure where the intensity of the stimulus is gradually increased or decreased until the person can or cannot perceive it. There are other techniques for measuring absolute threshold, but the method of limits is the simplest one. So measuring the absolute threshold is one way of determining the sensitivity of a system. But is that all? Is that the only thing which we require in terms of measuring sensitivity? But it's not the only thing we need to consider when measuring sensitivity. Sensitivity refers to the accuracy of a detection system. So there may be other factors that we need to take into account beyond just the absolute threshold. The accuracy of our detection system, such as the eye, and if it cannot detect something, the brain cannot interpret it and the person will not understand the physical world. So it's crucial for understanding the physical world. The sensitivity of the system is dependent on how well and how quickly and how accurately it can detect the presence of a stimulus from no stimulus, which is known as the absolute threshold. So is measuring the absolute threshold enough to understand the sensitivity of a system? No, it's not enough. We also need to measure the differential threshold, which is the point where people can perceive a change in the stimulus. This is important because simply knowing if a stimulus is present or not is not enough. The absolute threshold tells us the point at which we can first detect a stimulus, but it does not tell us anything about our ability to detect changes in the stimulus. So to measure our ability to detect changes, we need to measure the differential threshold. This is the point at which we can detect a difference between two stimuli. For example, we might be able to tell the difference between two perfumes that are similar but not exactly the same. Measuring the differential threshold helps us to understand how sensitive our senses are to the changes in the world around us. The absolute threshold only tells us if there is a stimulus or not, but the differential threshold helps us understand if any changes within the stimulus can be detected. Let's take an example of money. Imagine you have no money and someone gives you $1. Then you would consider it as having money. This $1 is the absolute threshold, the minimum amount of money you need to feel like you have money. But it's not enough to just know the absolute threshold. We also need to know how much of a change is needed for a person to notice the difference. For instance, if you have a $1 and someone gives you $2, you might not notice much of a difference. But if you have $1 and someone gives you $5, then you would notice the difference. This difference in stimulus is called the differential threshold or just noticeable difference. Now there is a change in the money value, then this is called the differential threshold. So, differential threshold is the amount of the stimulus change that should be made so that people are able to notice a difference, and that is called the just noticeable difference. So, let's talk about the differential threshold now. What is the differential threshold? The differential threshold is about how much the intensity of a stimulus needs to be increased from its starting level so that you can notice a change. This change is known as the just noticeable difference. The just noticeable difference is the smallest difference in the magnitude of the stimuli that a person can detect. It is the minimum amount of change that is needed in the stimulus for you to be able to tell the difference between two stimuli. For example, if you can tell the difference between a sound that is played at 50 decibels and another sound that is played at 55 decibels, then the just noticeable difference for sound intensity is 5 decibels. So let's take an example to make it more easier to understand. Imagine you are in a completely dark room and you cannot see anything. You light 4 candles and ask people if they can see the light or not. Most people will say that they can see the light. This means that the absolute threshold for this scenario is 4 candles. Now, how do you find out the differential threshold? To find out the differential threshold, you add one more candle to the 4 candles. Now, if people cannot tell the difference in the amount of light, you add another candle until they can see a difference. We basically want to find out how much more light we need to add to the 4 candles for people to notice a difference. This is called the differential threshold. Now let's say you added 3 more candles and now there are a total of 7 candles. People say that they can see a difference in the amount of light. So the differential threshold is 3 candles, which means that people need at least 3 more candles to perceive a difference in the amount of light. So, the differential threshold is the minimum amount of change in the stimulus needed for a person to notice a difference. And it's found by gradually increasing the stimulus until people can perceive a change. So, the differential threshold is the smallest amount of change needed in a stimulus for a person to notice a difference. For example, if a person can see a light from 4 candles, then adding one more candle may not be enough to notice a difference. But if you add 3 more candles, the person may say, now I can see the difference in the light. So that difference between the 4 candles and the 7 candles is the differential threshold. It is like the smallest noticeable change that can be detected by a person's senses. The differential threshold is determined by adding or subtracting the number of candles from the standard stimulus, which is the 4 candles in this case. The process of finding the differential threshold involves both increasing and decreasing the number of candles. When the person says he sees a difference, that number of candles is the differential threshold. By doing this many times with different people, you can get a better idea of the average differential threshold for a particular stimulus. The differential threshold, also known as the just noticeable difference, which is the smallest amount of change that a person can detect in a stimulus. So, to find the just noticeable difference for light intensity, for example, we start with a standard stimulus, which is the minimum amount of light needed for a person to detect it, let's say 4 candles. Then we add more candles until the person says they see a change in the light. Now, we repeat this process several times, sometimes increasing the number of candles and sometimes decreasing it. Sometimes increasing the number of candles and sometimes decreasing it to get an average. Let's say we find that the person can detect a difference when we add 3 candles to the standard stimulus of 4 candles. This means the just noticeable difference is 3 candles. So if we want to measure the accuracy or sensitivity of the person's ability to detect changes in the light intensity, we can use the just noticeable difference to determine how much change is needed for them to notice a difference. Now, just noticeable difference tells us how much change is needed in a stimulus for a person to notice the difference. But the problem is that the higher the starting level of the stimulus, the more change you need to make in order for the person to notice a difference. Let's understand how this concept really works. Imagine you have 2 light bulbs. One is brighter, let's say it's 100 watts, and the other one is less brighter, let's say it's 80 watts. So when you turn them both on, you may not notice a difference. So you lower the brightness of the less bright bulb little by little until you notice a difference. Let's say you notice a difference when it gets down to 20 watts. Now let's say you have a different pair of bulbs. One is 10 watts and the other one is 2 watts. So when you turn both on, you may not notice a difference. But when you increase the brightness of the less bright bulb, you notice a difference when it gets up to 4 watts. So what does this tell us? It tells us that when the difference between two things is small, we can notice a small change. But when the difference is large, we need a much bigger change to notice a difference. So the differential threshold is the amount of stimulus needed to be increased or decreased from a certain level to be noticeable to others, while the just noticeable difference is the minimum amount of difference required between two stimuli to distinguish between them. For example, if the initial stimulus is 4 candles, the just noticeable difference is 3 candles. It means that you would need to increase or decrease the number of candles by 3 in order to notice a difference. Another way to conduct experiments just noticeable difference is by using the method of standard comparison. In this method, we use a standard weight to compare with other weights. This is called the method of standard comparison. So first, you are given a weight that serves as the standard weight, and then you are given different weights to compare with the standard weight. So in this method of standard comparison, you first hold a standard weight in your hand, then you are given different weights to hold, and you have to decide whether they are lighter or heavier than the standard weight. Sometimes you might say the weight is lighter and sometimes you might say it's heavier. The weight at which you can just notice the difference from the standard weight is called the just noticeable difference. Now imagine holding a 1 kg weight in your hand as the standard weight. Then someone gives you different weights to hold that are related to the standard weight. Sometimes you might feel the weight is lighter and sometimes you might feel it is heavier. The weight at which you can tell that it is different from the standard weight, this will be the just noticeable difference. For example, if you have 1 kg weight and someone gives you 1.1 kg weight, but you cannot feel any difference, then it's not the just noticeable difference. The just noticeable difference or the differential threshold is the weight at which you can differentiate between two weights. For example, if you have 50 gram weight and I give you a 55 gram weight and you can tell the difference between them, then the weight difference of the 5 grams is the just noticeable difference. This is the smallest weight difference required for you to distinguish between two weights. The just noticeable difference is the smallest amount of change in a stimulus that a person can detect. For example, if you have 4 candles and you add 3 more candles to make it 7, then you can tell that the light is brighter compared to when you had 4 candles. So you can tell the difference between 4 candles and 7 candles. And then the just noticeable difference is 3 candles. Similarly, if you can tell the difference between 50 gram weight and 55 gram weight, then the just noticeable difference is 5 grams. Now, Heinrich Weber and Weber-Fechner were two scientists from Germany who did some experiments on threshold. So they were the first to conduct threshold experiments, and what did they find? their important finding was that our senses become less sensitive to changes in a stimulus as the intensity of the stimulus increases. In simpler terms, the bigger the stimulus, the harder it is to notice small changes in it. So, if you have 100-watt bulbs, you will require much higher sensitivity to notice changes in its brightness, or you will require a much higher sensitive bulb for measuring the intensity. If you have a less bright bulb like 40-watt bulb, it is easier to notice a small change in brightness compared to a brighter bulb like a 100-watt bulb. With a 40-watt bulb, a small increases of 2 or 4 watts will be noticeable, but with a 100-watt bulb, a much larger increase, maybe 20 or 40 watts is needed to notice a change in the brightness. Let's understand this in terms of a more physical or a more general concept. If you buy a packet of chips for $5 and the price is increased by $1, you will notice the difference. However, let's say you are buying a television which is costing $500 or $600 and then a change of $1 in the price is insignificant, and this won't make much difference to you. You won't be able to notice the difference in price. So the difference that you noticed when the $5 chips were increased by $1 or the change in the price of chips from $5 to $6 is noticeable because it is a significant change in comparison to the original price. To be noticeable in the price of a television that cost $500 or $600, the price would have to increase by a much larger amount, about 10%, which is around $50 or $60. This means that if the price is raised by $50 or $60, you will notice the same amount of difference as you notice with the chips. The scientist found that the larger the initial stimulus, the more change or increase is needed to notice the difference. This is what the scientist observed. So, across a wide range of stimulus circumstances, the degree to which a standard stimulus needs to be increased to be noticeable is proportional to the intensity of the standard stimulus, and that is what is called Weber's law or Weber-Fechner law. In other words, the more intense the standard stimulus is, the more it needs to be increased in order for the change to be noticed. Weber's law is a psychological principle that explains how we perceive change in a stimulus. It states that the differential threshold between two stimuli is proportional to the magnitude of the stimuli. This means that the minimum difference between two stimuli that we can detect is not a fixed amount, but rather it's a proportion of the intensity of the initial stimulus. Weber's law states that the smallest noticeable difference in a stimulus, known as the just noticeable difference, is a fixed proportion of the original stimulus, and it helps us understand how humans perceive and respond to changes in a sensory stimuli. So it means he said that the amount of change needed to notice a difference in a stimulus depends on how strong the stimulus is. If the stimulus is strong, we need a bigger change to notice a difference. This relationship is true for a variety of situations involving different level of stimuli. Weber's law is represented by the equation which is del S by S equals to C, where del S represents the change in the second stimulus, S represents the intensity of the initial stimulus, and C is the constant value. Now, according to Weber's law, if the initial stimulus is weak, a small change will be noticeable. But if it is strong, a larger change will be required to be noticed. Let's say you are holding a weight and the weight is 10 pounds. According to Weber's law, you would need to add another 1 pound to the weight in order for you to notice a difference. So the change in the weight, which is del S, is 1 pound, and the intensity of the initial weight, which is S, is the 10 pounds. Now from the equation we get that del S by S equals to C. So now 1 by 10 equals to 0.1. So which is C? C is equals to 0.1. So this means that in order for you to notice a difference, the change in weight needs to be about 10% of the initial weight. Let's say you are at a music concert and the sound level of the speaker is initially 60 decibel. Now, according to Weber's law, for you to detect a difference in the sound, the change in sound level, which is del S, needs to be proportional to the initial sound level, which is S, and multiplied by a constant, which is C. So now let's say the constant is 0.1. So if the sound level increases to 66 decibel, the change in the sound level would be del S equals to 66 decibel minus 60 decibel, which is 6 decibel. So to find out if this change is noticeable to you, we can use Weber's law, which is del S by S equals to C. So here 0.1 equals to 0.1. So since the ratio of del S to S is equals to the constant, this change in sound level would just be noticeable according to Weber's law. Weber's law suggests that the stronger the initial stimulus, the larger the change needed to notice a difference. However, researchers have found that this law does not always work in the same way for all types of stimuli. The change needed for a stimulus to be noticeable may vary depending on the type of the stimulus, such as clothing or food. For example, the change needed to notice a difference in the price of chips may not be the same as the change needed to notice a difference in the price of the clothes. So what Fechner did was he came up with a new law which is called the logarithmic law, which is valid in different situations. So according to this law, R equals to C log of del S by S, where del S is the change in the stimulus that needs to be compared, S is the standard stimulus, C is the constant, and R is the factor that tells us how much difference should be there. So basically what this law says that the bigger the thing you are comparing to, the more you need to change it to notice a difference. For example, if you have a 100 watt bulb, you might need a 150 watt bulb to notice a difference. Imagine you have a light bulb that's not very bright, only 40 watt. If you increase the watt by just a little bit, say 41 to 42, people will notice the difference. But if you have a really bright light bulb, let's say 100 watt bulb, you will need to increase the watt by much more, maybe 50 watts for people to notice a difference. So the stronger the initial stimulus, the more you have to increase it to make a noticeable difference. Weber's law states that the stronger the initial stimulus, the larger the change required in the comparison stimulus for a person to notice a difference. However, what Fechner did was, Fechner proposed a logarithmic way of measuring this because Weber's law does not apply to all type of stimuli. So this is how absolute and differential threshold really works, and that defines the sensitive system. The absolute and the differential threshold are important for understanding the sensitivity of our sensory system. To understand how sensitive our senses are, we need to look at the absolute and differential threshold. Next comes the signal detection theory, the theory of signal detection. So what exactly is signal detection theory? Let us start by understanding this theory. So I will cover some part of this theory in this lecture and some in the next lecture. So what is this theory is all about? Now, the signal detection theory is a theory about how we interpret information. It says that the information we receive has two parts. One is the important part, which is called signal, and another one is the unimportant part, which is called noise. So we need to be able to detect the signal from the noise in order to understand the information correctly. It's basically distinguish between important information, which is signal, from the unimportant information, which is noise. The theory starts by acknowledging that our sensory system is not always accurate when passing through signals, because the signal is mixed with external noise from the environment and internal noise from the brain. This is because any stimulus that we receive is accompanied by noise from both external and internal sources, which makes it difficult to detect the stimulus accurately. It becomes challenging to detect and distinguish the actual signal from the noise. Now, this signal detection theory is a very important theory because it is used not only in psychology but also in a variety of other electrical engineering subjects or a number of other subjects. So, what is this theory about? How does this theory start? Now, to understand this theory in its most basic form or to simplify the theory, let's think about medical profession. So first, I will give you an overview of the theory and then I will try to explain you how does this theory come about. The theory of signal detection can be understood by looking at how medical professionals use it. For example, we often visit doctors for medical tests such as X-rays and MRIs and so many other tests. The process of how a doctor diagnoses a disease is an example of the basic concept behind signal detection theory. So how does a doctor determine if you have a specific disease when examining your X-rays or MRI? And every doctor has a certain set of criteria to determine if there is an issue or not. For instance, let's say if a patient has a broken bone or cancer, the doctor will examine an X-ray to determine whether the bone is broken or not based on their criteria. Now, how does the doctor determine if the bone is broken or not based on an X-ray? The doctor examines the X-ray and applies certain criteria or parameters, and based on which they make decision whether the bone is broken or not. For example, in the case of an MRI, how do you decide whether the bone is broken or not? Now, the doctor utilizes certain parameters that he has acquired through his training and experience to make a decision whether the bone is broken or not. These parameters can include characteristics like the intensity of the black and white regions in the X-ray, the location of the fracture, and say the level of concentration in the affected areas and so on. In addition to these parameters, the doctor might also use other tests like blood test. So the doctor can also observe a swelling in the area where the bone is suspected to be broken, which can cause a different shading on the X-ray. By combining information from various medical reports such as blood test and other tests, the doctor can determine whether or not you have a broken bone. So if you show the same X-ray report to multiple doctors, different doctors may have different interpretations of the same X-ray report, leading to different opinion on whether a bone is broken or not. The signal detection theory explains how doctors use their own parameters and characteristics to make this decision. Some doctors may be more cautious about their diagnosis, maybe they are more conservative about their decision-making process, while other doctors may be more lenient or liberal while doing any diagnosis. So some doctors are more liberal and rely solely on the X-ray to determine if a bone is broken or not, while other doctors who are more conservative may order additional tests to verify the diagnosis. The conservative doctors prefer to have more data and parameters to increase their accuracy in determining whether the bone is broken or not. So this is how signal detection theory works. So more data you have, the more information you have. Signal detection theory involves using certain parameters and characteristics to make decisions based on available data or information. The more data or information available, the more accurate the decision is likely to be. This theory is applicable in medical diagnosis, where doctors use various tests and parameters to arrive at a conclusion. Some doctors may be more conservative and order more tests to ensure the accuracy, while others may rely on a single test or parameter. When doctors examine X-rays to determine if a bone is broken or not, their approach can differ. Different doctors use different criteria to determine whether a bone is broken or not based on an X-ray. Different doctors may rely on different parameters or characteristics to make this determination. For example, a doctor may look at the amount of white or gray shading around a certain area of the X-ray. If there is more gray shading, it may indicate a broken bone. Some doctors may only look at one or two characteristics, such as the amount of graying or whiteness in a certain area. In such cases, the doctor may use only two characteristics to arrive at a conclusion, while other doctors may consider up to 5 or 6 criteria to make a decision. This criteria may include not only graying or whitening, but also factors such as site differentiation, neighboring areas, and comparisons to previous X-rays. Ultimately, the doctor will make their decision based on 4 or 5 features from the X-ray. This process of deciding if a bone is broken or not and how many characteristics to consider is the signal detection theory. If you quickly and easily say a bone is broken based on an X-ray, you may be right, but there is also a chance that you could be wrong and it's not actually broken, which is a possibility of a false alarm. The more easily you make decision, the greater the chance of false alarms. So sometimes the images on the X-ray may not be reliable, and what you are seeing may be due to the X-ray film itself, not an actual injury. So basically, if a doctor is too lenient in their decision making, or if they don't conduct multiple tests to confirm if a bone is broken or not, they might end up making more errors. For example, if you make a mistake and say that the bone is broken when it's actually not, it can cause discomfort for the patient who has to wear a plaster cast unnecessarily. This may lead to the patient not returning to you for further treatment. On the other hand, if a doctor is more conservative and takes more tests before making any decision, they are less likely to make errors. They only diagnose a broken bone when they are absolutely sure. This might mean the patient has to wait longer for a diagnosis, but it's better to be safe than sorry. So, if a doctor takes a long time and uses many parameters to determine if a bone is broken, it could cost the patient a lot of money and time, and they may not want to go back to the doctor either. The patient might think that the doctor is always correct but just does unnecessary tests. On the other hand, a doctor who quickly decides that a bone is broken just by looking at the X-ray might be too liberal. This doctor might put a plaster on a patient who does not actually have a broken bone, and as a result, the patient won't come back to this doctor again. So how can you determine whether an X-ray shows a broken bone or just an error on the film? This process is known as signal detection theory, which is being demonstrated here. Signal detection theory is a way for doctors to try to figure out the best way to tell if a bone is broken or not. They use different criteria and look at different things on the X-ray to make their decision. So, signal detection theory is a way of figuring out how to differentiate the signal and noise, and where signal is the important aspect and the noise is non-important aspect. In the case of X-rays, the white areas you see around the bone are the important signals, while the gray areas are not always due to the bone itself but could be due to the noise caused by the X-ray film. So, how do you differentiate between this unimportant aspect and the important aspect? Distinguish between unimportant aspect and important aspect is what the signal detection theory actually does. It makes you understand what is the difference between these two things and how to make the difference. Signal detection theory helps us distinguish between these two and figure out which information is truly important. So, since this will require more time, I will spend more time to understanding signal detection theory in the next class. Now I will stop here and try to review what we did in this lecture, and we will go over signal detection theory in more detail in the next lecture. So in this lecture, we looked at what the sensory system is all about. Also, we learned about what is the sensory system and what are the requirements of a sensory system. We also defined a sensory system and defined it as a system that takes in external information and inputs it into the brain or the psychological system. So in this lecture, we learned about the functioning of the sensory system, which is responsible for converting physical stimuli into psychological experiences. And we explored the process of how this conversion takes place. For example, temperature. Temperature in degrees is converted into cold and hot, and that is what a sensory system is. Then we looked at how the sensory system really works. We also talked about the concept of a sensory system and the two parameters that determine how the sensory system works. We already talked about how the sensory system encodes information. So we discussed two important aspects of the sensory system, which are sensitivity and sensory coding. So far, we have only covered sensitivity and sensory coding. So, in order to measure the sensitivity of a system or how accurate a system is, you must first understand two concepts, which are absolute threshold and another one is differential threshold, which we covered in this class, and we discussed in detail what is absolute threshold and what is differential threshold. We try to figure out what the difference between absolute and differential threshold is. But just understanding absolute threshold and differential threshold is not enough. We also talked about noise from the signals and why this noise exists. We learned how to distinguish between signal and noise and why noise exists. Noise can occur due to inherent noise present in the stimulus or due to the white noise that exists in the human brain. Our brain has some inherent noise on its own, which can make it difficult to detect a stimulus. And signal detection theory helps us understand how we decide whether a stimulus is present or not, and how noise and stimulus combine to make us say yes or no to a signal. Signal detection theory deals with how humans detect stimuli and differentiate between signal and noise. It's all about how we detect things and how we distinguish important signals from background noise. In the upcoming lecture, we will learn about signal detection theory and how it helps to differentiate important signals from noise. Also, we will explore how biological processes encode external stimuli, especially in the visual system. We will learn how the visual system makes sense of stimuli and how sensory system work in general. So that is what we will be doing in the next lecture. So until the next lecture, goodbye and thank you.